When we think of total environmental exclusion zones, we imagine places like Chernobyl, Ukraine. But believe it or not, America has its own exclusion areas, with some striking similarities. Take Times Beach, Missouri. Just 30 minutes outside of St. Louis, it was once a bustling municipality of over 200,000 people spread across 400 acres. However, if you drive past it today, all you'll see is a massive artificial hill, a containment mound that seals away the bulldozed foundations, automobiles, personal belongings, and structural remains of over 800 homes and businesses. Buried right alongside them are also the remains of lost Route 66 diners and novelty roadhouses that once made this town a textbook example of Americana. Yet what makes this story so unbelievable is how the town fell apart. You see, to solve a simple dust problem on 16 miles of unpaved roads, city officials hired a local waste oil hauler to spray the grid for 6 cents a gallon. What they didn't know was that he was secretly mixing his oil with thousands of gallons of pure industrial chemical waste, inadvertently turning every road in the town into a toxic runway. So how did this once thriving section of Route 66 become a forbidden wasteland? And what, if anything, still remains today? Stay tuned to find out as we explore the rise, fall, and total erasure of Times Beach. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Let's go back to the early 1920s, when the nearby city of St. Louis was a booming industrial center choked with heat and factory smog during the summer months. In that context, working-class families were desperate for a weekend escape, and they frequently chose the cool waters of the Merrimack River. In turn, local real estate promoters saw an opportunity to sell summer cottages, hotels, and all the rest of it. But one newspaper took things to a whole new level. In 1925, the St. Louis Times launched an aggressive marketing gimmick. Basically, the paper bought up 400 acres of low-laying, flood-prone farmland along the river, divided it into thousands of microscopic 20 by 100 foot lots, and then offered those lots to anyone willing to buy a 6-month subscription to their newspaper for just $67.50. At first, the stunt worked like a charm. St. Louis residents flocked to the area by the hundreds, putting up humble wooden shacks, weekend cottages, and summer bungalows on stilts to keep them above the river's high water mark. It was cheap, it was close to the water, and it gave urban families a little slice of summer paradise. But then came 1932, and with it, a massive catalyst for growth: the official realignment of US Route 66 directly through the edge of town. To handle the new surge of traffic across the Merrimack River, engineers constructed a steel truss bridge, funneling thousands of cross-country travelers right past Times Beach. Just like that, the quiet weekend retreat transformed into a vibrant Route 66 transit hub. Roadside diners went up, neon-lit gas stations opened, and in 1935, developers constructed the iconic Bridgehead Inn, a stone roundhouse catering to the wary motorists cruising along the Mother Road. And by mid-20th century, Times Beach was riding high on that post-war American road trip boom. So, as you might imagine, that initial shanty town had evolved into something much greater. This is where those seasonal cottages were gradually enclosed and winterized into permanent year-round homes. By 1954, the population hit nearly 200,000 residents, and the community officially incorporated as a city. But behind the scenes was one seemingly benign structural flaw: dust. For reference, Times Beach was a low-income municipality with a tiny tax base, which meant while the town had 16 miles of residential streets, it couldn't afford to pave a single one of them. And during the dry summer months, those 16 miles of dirt and gravel created a suffocating cloud of dust that covered everything in town. Hence, the city needed a way to keep that dust down, setting the stage for a decision that ultimately would seal their fate. To trace where this nightmare truly began, we have to look roughly 200 miles southwest to the small rural town of Verona, Missouri. This is where, in 1969, a company called Nepico leased an old chemical factory to make chemicals used in things like antibacterial soap and medical cleansers. But there was a problem. The process left behind a dark, sludge-like byproduct that chemical workers call still bottoms. And buried inside that sludge was something even worse, a lethal compound known as 2378-TCDD, or simply dioxin. For reference, dioxin is one of the most dangerous synthetic toxics ever created by science. Even in tiny amounts, it attacks organs, causes severe skin disorders, leads to birth defects, and triggers cancer. So Nepico had thousands of gallons of this stuff just piling up in their storage tanks, and they needed to get rid of it as cheaply as possible. Now, the way they got rid of it was far from ethical. Enter subcontracting waste oil hauler, Russell Martin Bliss. Bliss operated a local waste oil business, collecting used motor oil from gas stations and factories across the eastern part of Missouri. And in 1971, Nepico hired his company to haul away their chemical sludge. Allegedly, Bliss drained thousands of gallons of the tainted still bottoms from the Verona plant and hauled it back to his own storage facility in Frontenac, Missouri, where he pumped the chemical sludge directly into his storage tanks, mixing it straight into his own inventory of used motor oil. Oh, and I should probably point out that Russell Bliss later claimed that he had no idea the chemical waste was so hazardous, assuming that mixing the toxin in to get rid of it on road dust was no big deal. Regardless, allegations state that Bliss now had tens of thousands of gallons of this dangerous cocktail and marketed as a solution to environmental dust. Enjoying a surprising amount of interest, people actually hired him to spray this waste on things like dirt roads, trails, and so on. And it wouldn't take long for the clients to notice that something was off. The first warning came in May of '71 at the stables near Moscow Mills. The horse arena's owner, Judy Pyatt, hired Bliss to spray waste oil inside her indoor riding ring to keep the dust down. But within days, birds began falling to their deaths out of the building's rafters. Then, over the coming months, 62 horses fell violently ill, lost their hair, and died agonizing deaths. Though the final straw came when Judy's 6-year-old daughter was rushed to the hospital with severe health symptoms. The owner suspected the oil as the culprit, and the veterinarians agreed. And so the hunt was on, but it would take until 1974 for investigators at the Disease Control Center to trace the mystery toxin from the stables back to Nepico's toxic sludge. In the meantime, as federal scientists were piecing together the disaster, city officials over in Times Beach were none the wiser. Remember, they had those 16 miles of unpaved roads and a tight municipal budget. So the city council there saw spraying as the perfect solution. Between 1972 and 1976, the city paid Russell Bliss just 6 cents a gallon to spray his waste oil mixture across every dirt road in town. Year after year, Bliss's truck drove up and down the residential grid, spraying roughly 160,000 gallons of toxic sludge directly onto the soil where children played, dogs ran, and residents walked. For a time, the residents were thrilled with the solution. The dust was gone, but what they didn't realize is that their entire city was being transformed into one of the most contaminated residential sites on the North American continent. By the early 1980s, residents began suffering from issues like chronic nosebleeds, unexplained organ damage, and rare cancer clusters. As of course, the local animal population was facing similar challenges. Even so, almost no one suspected the source until late 1982, when men in hazmat suits suddenly arrived to scrap samples from the soil. As it turns out, the paper trail left by Russell Bliss had finally led the authorities up Route 66 to Times Beach. Locals watched in confusion as technicians scraped up the dirt from places where their kids played. The test results were sent off to laboratories, but before those findings could ever make it back to City Hall, disaster struck from a completely different direction. On November the 3rd, 1982, torrential rains hit eastern Missouri, causing the Merrimack River to overflow its banks in a historic flood. By December the 5th, the river crested at a staggering 43 feet. This is when floodwaters completely submerged Times Beach, swallowing homes, washing out roads, and forcing all 2,000 residents to evacuate. But the water did something far worse than just ruin furniture. It dislodged years of dioxin-saturated topsoil from those 16 miles of unpaved roads and churned it up into a thick, poisonous sludge, meaning this poison was washed directly into people's living rooms, carpets, wall installations, and backyards. 3 weeks later, as residents returned in rubber boots to scrape floor mud out of their homes, they didn't know that they were effectively cleaning up a toxic wasteland. And it was around this time that the EPA's test results finally came back. They were bad. And I'd like to place a little emphasis here. The CDC's official safety threshold for dioxin contamination in soil was 1 part per billion. In contrast, the samples taken from Times Beach didn't exceed the limit, they shattered it, with concentrations spiking as high as 127 parts per billion. So on December the 23rd, 1982, right in the middle of the town's holiday gatherings, news broke across the radio and TV. The CDC issued an unprecedented public warning. Anyone who had evacuated the flood was urged to never return. The residents were told that touching the mud, breathing the dust, or tracking the soil out of the town on their shoes could pose severe long-term health risks. Then came the final blow. On February the 22nd, 1983, when the EPA administrator stood before reporters and announced an extraordinary $33 million federal buyout of the entire municipality using Superfund authority. By April of 1985, residents voted to officially dissolve their city. From that point forward, federal agents fenced off the entire perimeter, posted armed security checkpoints at the gates, and placed Times Beach under permanent quarantine. In other words, America now had its very own exclusion zone. Once the National Guard showed up at Times Beach, the federal government had to confront another terrifying reality. Millions of tons of dioxin was still sitting on a floodplain. There were also hundreds of abandoned homes still filled with personal artifacts, such as toys, furniture, and family heirlooms, all of which was permanently deemed hazardous waste. As the town's refugees were forced to restart their entire lives, the federal government was left to clean up that mess. But what about Russell Bliss? Well, he enjoyed a surprisingly easy exit. Despite his name being plastered across national news, he was never really held criminally liable for the contamination, maintaining to his death that he had no idea the waste was toxic. In fact, the legal system ultimately hit him with a single year in prison, and that sentence was for tax fraud. In terms of the cleanup, the challenge was monumental. In order to destroy the toxin, the EPA built specialized high-temperature mobile incinerators directly on site. Over a grueling multi-year operation spanning between 96 and 97, crews excavated and burned roughly 240,000 tons of tainted soil and debris gathered from Times Beach and dozens of other eastern Missouri sites. Everything else, the non-burnable materials like bulldozed foundations, crushed cars, household appliances, and the pews of the local church, were flattened and buried directly on site inside of a massive containment pit. From there, the pit was covered in thick layers of clay, topsoil, and grass, a feature now known locally as the Town Mound. By October of 1999, the former town officially reopened to the public as Route 66 State Park, meaning if you visit today, you can walk or bike along the paved trails, which follow the exact grid of the lost streets. To the best of my research, the only original building left standing is the Bridgehead Inn, which now serves as the park's visitor center. Nearby, the historic Merrimack River Bridge still stands, although it too has been permanently closed. Other than that, Times Beach was completely wiped from the map. A special thanks to the visitor who submitted the story idea. If any of you watching have an idea for a topic we should cover, or perhaps you're a historian with your own story to tell, get in touch with me using the YouTube community section or the submission form found in the description box of every video. Otherwise, as always, this is Ryan Socash signing off.